Welcome back to the Encounter Faith Podcast, everybody. My name is Ross, and I have the privilege of having these conversations. And today I get to say, welcome back, Pastor Greg Wenhold.
Hey,
Pastor Greg,
Ross,
welcome back.
it's good to be with you.
Now, I love doing these with you for a couple of reasons. One is I feel like every time I talk to you, I want to bottle up your energy, and I would never have to drink coffee ever again. But also, every time I wind up learning something from you, or seeing something that I thought I knew from a different perspective. And today we're talking about Lent, this thing that almost everyone listening, and probably everyone who takes the time to listen to this podcast, has a pre-existing relationship with, and therefore have assumptions about, or have a sense of, man, this is how I do this and this works, or this isn't how it worked. We're going to dive into that a little bit later. What I want to start with, though, in this season of Lent is, why does this matter in 2025? Why is Lent such an important thing for us, churches like ours, but ultimately just for an individual believer? Why do we do this?
Lent is a season of preparation. The church leans into seasons from time to time. Two major ones that I think more readily are available in church. One would be Advent prior to Christmas, the 4 weeks prior. And then this season of Lent, which obviously it fluctuates due to when Easter will be.
Right.
But you back off from Easter 40 days and you find yourself on a Wednesday of what we know as Ash Wednesday, the start of Lent. And it is a season of preparation. It first originated in the early church as followers were trying to grow their faith and get deeper. And so there was a season of fasting prior to the time when they would celebrate the resurrection on Easter Sunday. And it was a big part of church. In fact, it was so important to them that when they took that journey, oftentimes it would lead to baptism services in traditional liturgical church happen on the eve of Easter. And so you would have a service that would begin and it would start and crest into the midnight hour, or the awakening hour of Easter Day. He is risen, with baptisms. And it was a flourishing time for the church. When did it historically begin? It really began, Constantine was the first, his emperor was dealing with a really difficult time with a guy by the name of Arius, and he was saying, it was called the Arian controversy, and he was saying that Jesus was not divine.
Okay.
And so Constantine goes, we got to take this baby on. We got to do something. He calls the church together.
Sorry, I'm imagining Constantine literally saying, we got to take this baby on.
We got to shut this down right now. So he calls the church together, and it's the Council of Nicaea. And from there comes a creedal formula. One of the first creedal formulas is the Nicene Creed. And so it shuts it down, but it also establishes Lent as more of a discipline for the church to engage so that we don't get off track, we keep moving. And so there are these 40 days, not counting Sundays.
Right.
So if people are listening to this and they have found where Ash Wednesday is this year, and they go to Easter and they go, no, you're telling us a lie. It's not true. No, you just don't count Sundays, and you will find yourself at Easter, and it's an amazing adventure.
Yeah. And I think it can be. One of my concerns about any sort of season of preparation in this moment that we find ourselves in 2025 is we don't like to take time to prepare things. It's the microwave culture cliche. And my concern about how that manifests itself in Lent is that people wind up simplifying this season. Did I give up the right thing? Was I humble enough during Ash Wednesday? And wind up creating kind of a binary paradigm to something that at least I believe is inherently a little bit more messy.
Right.
What I'm curious about is these practices that sort of rise to the top of of people's awareness during Lent. I have this perception that people view some of these practices as like, man, I got to get it right or I got to get it wrong. And as a result, they wind up elevating the practice over where the practice is supposed to be pointing people towards. When you encounter that as a pastor, I'm curious how you help people zoom out so that they're not so caught up in the minutia about, did I give up the right thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the more you can invite people into the season as something which will be good for their lives, their practical lives, but more importantly for their physical soul, their spiritual soul, that they become a better person diving into this journey. And you're right. You had mentioned people giving things up. That has been the tradition. I'm going to make myself less than. And, when you receive ash on Ash Wednesday and someone says to you, from dust you have come, to dust you'll return. Yeah. As someone who does impose those ash, I feel like somebody's going to haul off and whack me one of these times, saying, that's not very complimentary. And
sure.
It's not intended to be. It's supposed to put us in the right juxtaposition with God, so that we understand God is mighty and powerful and we are not.
Yeah.
Sinful, broken, unclean. And he, though, cares about who we are to the extent that he is going to give to us his son on the cross to die for our sins, to be that atoning sacrifice. And we're going to celebrate that at Easter, Good Friday, Easter, the Holy Week adventure. And we're going to make our way much more clear. So to someone who says, okay, this isn't even lots of this, the moments are in the Bible of Good Friday and Easter. Monday, Thursday, the new commandment I give you around the table, they're there. But Ash Wednesday is not there. And so it's not a biblical day.
Sure.
But we are told that we were created from dust.
Yep.
Out of the dust of the earth, God blows his breath into us and we become his creation. And we understand too that one day this body that we're, using is on borrowed time. Mm-hmm. We basically rent a body, it's like God gives it to us. Sure. We do our best. It slowly disintegrates to the time that after we're dead, if we're not cremated, which is a quick version of what will happen. We're going to be put into the ground and someone will come back years later and we'll be dust.
Yeah.
And it just gives us this humility that in our culture today, I'd have to say, from my perspective, I'm a little bit older than you are, but from my perspective, I think we're all yearning for humility. We just don't know how to ask for it. And, there are a lot of pride surfaces, a lot of, I know what the answers are. I know how to do life. And really when we come to the place where, the teacher says, okay, time is, you've got your pencils, take your test, move on. We don't know how to be humble.
Yeah.
We struggle with that. And Lent as a season drives you to that. It says, kind of like just step back away, from the madness and just say it's okay to be fragile.
Yeah.
It's okay to be broken. It's okay to be struggling with your life. You have a God who's going to care for you and get you through this.
I love that. It makes me think of, we'll use social media just as an example. I think, especially now compared to 2011, 2010, when social media was first rolling out, I think about the difference between my social media experience and my sister-in-law, who's 8 years younger than me. And she grew up in a world that had an algorithm, a world that incentivized rage and a clickbait type of culture that really I predated. And what that meant was that I got to see how these things shifted. For her, it was the water she always swam in. And as a result, I think you're exactly right. I had never thought about it that way, but that we have this sense of lack that permeates in every part of our society. We all know that doom scrolling isn't helpful, and yet so many of us spend so much of our time doom scrolling. And I love the idea of Lent being this invitation to more, because everyone's looking for more. And wouldn't it be the most countercultural thing in the world that the more can be filled by something that people have been doing for thousands of years.
Right. And the 40 days, the church has leaned into a couple of scriptural moments of 40 day. One was where Jesus is tempted by the devil. Before he begins his ministry, he's in the desert, the wilderness for 40 days. Another is Moses has to hang out up on Mount Sinai for 40 days for God to speak. And we do live in a culture, we want it now, we wanted it yesterday.
Right.
And when we don't get things, we get frustrated and then we move on to the next best thing. And if there's one thing I've learned in my life is if I want to find true significance, the best thing is to wait on God. And waiting on God sounds boring. It sounds like, what? I got to wait on you, God? But that is, in truth, what we're called to do, is be still. Know that I am God is one of the wonderful images of the psalmist. Just quiet down, get out of your anxiety-filled, ridden brain, your journey that you're on as a human being to want to climb the best ladder you can find until you get to the top rung and you don't know what to do anyway.
Yep.
To make $1 gazillion, and then you're going to stop and you're going to go, so what do I do with it all now? And if we don't find our true wiring, we're going to get lost. And God's the one that wired us. So Lent's a time to come back to the great Creator and just to sit humbly, be still, and let God kind of clear the decks. Now, if that means we have to give something up to get ourselves right with that, that's fine. I always like to say, what am I going to add to my life during Lent? That will be positive, not just another wild, crazy adventure. But what do I have to add that maybe it's a serving opportunity? Maybe it's, making sure one of the things my wife does that I marvel at, she's better at this than I am, is every day during Lent, she thinks of someone who she needs to make a phone call to, old school.
Love that.
She dials them up. She doesn't text them. She doesn't email them. She tries to get them in a verbal moment. Obviously, she leaves some messages. Those people, though, from what she says to them, I care about you, how you doing, what's going on in your life. She'll end up receiving phone calls back. I
love that.
And the cycle and circle gets connected.
Yeah.
And something sweet happens.
I love that. I think what I particularly appreciate about that, and what I would hope listeners pay attention to, I think especially if you've been part of a church tradition like ours for a long time, I think one of two things happen. You either overcomplicate Lent, where you try to kind of, like you were saying, how humble can I make myself, right? Or you fall into something that's rote. You give up chocolate every year and you don't really think about it ever again.
Lose a couple LBs.
Right.
Yeah.
But then you wind up, what I love about what Eileen does is everyone listening knows how to do that. And if you're younger, I'll say, you don't even have to call them. Eileen calls them because that's their context, right? But like, that is such a approachable thing for people. If, to sort of continue down this thread, if I'm someone who, I've said this before, probably to you even, like, my biggest concern for people in Easter, for Lent for 2025, is that Easter sneaks up on them. Because if you come from a background like mine, where it was fairly low church, non-denominational, I remember vividly being a kid and having a series that was the best week ever and not knowing why they were talking about it like that. Or if you come from a tradition like this, where we're talking about Lent, we're talking about the fact that Easter's coming, but it could feel like, oh, this is a church service where I'm doing churchy things. What does that moment of discovery look like for folks where they are engaged in a practice, but they discover a new way of thinking about it, or they have been walking with Jesus for a long time and they receive some level of, to use a super churchy term, some level of fresh revelation that I would imagine at least is also not that complicated. I think sometimes we're expecting, to go back to waiting on God, we're expecting God to show up in these big ways. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the way he shows up is just by slightly redirecting where we're going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. The rhythm of Lent is unique if we allow it to be.
Yeah.
And for me, that's very much a key to life anyway. And it's, I'm sure we've all gotten to the place, people listening, all have gotten to the place where you're just tired. You've had a really difficult week. You can't wait for the weekend. Wednesday's the hump day. You got to get to Friday living for the weekend, and you get there and you just crash.
Yeah.
And then you start it up again on Monday morning, and things kick back into gear. That is not a healthy rhythm, and we know that. Everyone knows that. I do believe God has placed into every human being a natural rhythm. I don't know if you've ever heard of the circadian rhythm. Yeah. Things happen on the face of the earth in a creation form. Seasons are a rhythm, and Lent happens to birth into a season where we hope even in Chicago there will be spring.
Yeah.
We know that might be fleeting because it could be tempting us one day and be 90 degrees the next, but it is what we venture into. I lived for 5 years in Phoenix, Arizona, and every morning you'd get up far and away, 98% of the time it was sunny and beautiful, and you looked outside and you could go swimming, you could go out and run, you could walk, very little rain, and people would say, wow, that's how I want to live my life. But for me, the sameness really got me into a bad place. When we moved back here, I love the seasons. And although I don't like when it gets to minus whatever here in Chicago, it definitely, though, clears your jets. It helps recalibrate and reset back to your original place. And Lent has a way of doing that. And I would invite people into that. Just open up yourself to say it's okay to know before God that you are sinful and unclean and broken. He's not judging. He is redeeming through this season.
Where I want to land things in context, part of the message that you gave yesterday was, forgive me if I'm misquoting, but it was this idea of before we can celebrate the resurrection, we have to recognize the cross. Before we can embrace the victory that the resurrection is, we have to understand and walk in this space of suffering.
Correct.
There's folks who are listening who they're in the middle of that. And all they're looking for is those moments of celebration. All they're looking for is, to extend this metaphor, like they're begging for Easter. How do you come alongside those folks with empathy without sort of becoming a cliche of phrases that they've probably already heard before? Like, what does it look like to walk with people in that?
And it is an interesting question because there is no doubt about it. All of us like the party and the celebration more than we like the journey to, a few years ago, I was physically able, maybe not as much, to run. And so I put my hat in and ran a few marathons. Yeah. And it was great to cross the finish line. It was great to finish. But when I look back, the journey was in the training. It was in the pain of the moment of recognizing that we can make strides and we can move forward. And so the cross it's the most painful, grueling, gruesome moment on the face of this earth. I mean, Rome used that as their way of just taking people down. It was death. It was a death sentence to be nailed to the cross. That's why you were were nailed there. Mostly there were people that were not abiding by the Roman rule. And so that is the instrument God uses to allow for his son to go to the cross to die. And although that is a majestic thing that God does, the reason why he does that is for the broken, anxious, crazy people like you and me. Mm-hmm. And so the cross is for us. The resurrection shows the majesty and power of God. And I want to sit in the majesty and power of God, but I will also want to be in the place where I know God loves me that much that he's not going to toss me aside because I'm broken and I'm corrupt and I don't do the things I'm supposed to do. He's going to bring new life into my life. And the way he does that is through the cross, which we've been just lifting up. It is the wood, the cross, the wood between the worlds.
Nice. Okay, I lied before about where I'm landing the plane because I got one more question. But again, listener, if you don't like it, get your own podcast. So what I'm curious about for people is this struck me yesterday, and thinking about the book that we've based the series around talks a lot about the scandal of the cross. You were just talking about the humiliation of it. And for whatever reason, yesterday struck me about the physical impact of Jesus' body as he's being tortured into the cross. One of the things I'm curious about is there's a lot of people listening, a lot of people in our church, a lot of people in our culture who something is wrong with their bodies, to put it mildly, or to put a blanket statement over it, I should say. It could just be like things that used to not hurt, or it could be a diagnosis of some kind. What does it look like for folks to recognize that even these physical things that we're talking about here, or that they're feeling, I should say, God has also felt? Because I think it's easier for people to connect the idea that like Jesus wept, that's in the Bible. But because we sanitize the cross, I think we sometimes miss the fact that like every pain possible, Jesus has also felt.
Yeah. And you know, once again, going back to what you had asked before and what we had talked about before, is we don't see pain in the resurrection.
Yeah.
He's alive. He lives. You know, let's move on with life. But you're exactly right. If you track the stories of Jesus in any of the Gospels, he meets people where they are. He has compassion and love for where they are while he brings the truth of this powerful Father that he's connected to. And the John prayer where he says, you know, I'm the vine, you are the branches, and if you abide in me, you will bear good fruit. But he never promises that it's going to be like a cakewalk, that everything's going to be fine, no problems whatsoever. And our God did endure the cross. Could God have snapped his fingers, waved a wand? Could God have commanded Rome in an instant and sat on a throne and everything would have been fine? We still would be broken because we chose in the narrative. So in the garden, things are pure. We chose to walk away from God. And this is God's moment where he says, I'm going to go and I'm going to break the body of my son for you so that you will be restored. And that's the joy of the resurrection, that the power of God meets us in our intimate frailty. He is the atoning sacrifice. And without him, we're just mere spectators of a risen Christ. And where does it meet our brokenness? We still walk away broken and unclean? No. When we meet the risen Christ, we have the opportunity to become a new creation. The old is gone, as Paul says, and the new, it's come.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran, and our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.